Crimean War, Part 1. The River of Fire. Alma, 1854. The sea was restless that September morning. Grey waves heaved beneath a brooding sky, gulls wheeling and crying above the spray. And out on that churning water lay an armada, a vast, improbable city of sails and smokestacks. From horizon to horizon, ships rolled with the swell. There were British warships, black-hulled and bristling with cannon. French transports, their decks crowded with zouaves in bright red trousers. Turkish vessels flying the crescent moon. All gathered together, allies of circumstance, brought by fear of Russian expansion and the fragile balance of Europe. The Crimean War had come, and this fleet, 150 ships strong, was about to disgorge tens of thousands of men onto the stony beaches of the Crimean Peninsula. Their objective, Sevastopol. The Crimean War did not begin with the roar of cannon, but with an argument that, on the surface, seemed almost absurd. It was about keys to a church, about who should hold authority over the Christian holy places in Jerusalem. Catholic monks backed by France, or Orthodox priests backed by Russia. For months, diplomats bickered over altars and relics, over rights to repair a roof or light a lamp. But the shrines of the Holy Land were only the spark. Beneath the surface lay a question far greater, one that had haunted Europe for decades. What was to become of the Ottoman Empire? By the mid-19th century, the empire of the sultans was a shadow of its former glory. Once it had stretched across 3 continents. Now it was weak, corrupt, and crumbling. Nationalist uprisings shook its provinces. Its armies were outdated, its treasury drained. European powers referred to it with a mixture of pity and calculation as the sick man of Europe. To Russia, this weakness was opportunity. The Tsar dreamed of pushing south, of dominating the Black Sea and prizing open the door to the Mediterranean. He imagined Russian warships sailing freely through the Straits of Constantinople. He cast himself as the protector of Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. But protection was only another word for expansion. Britain and France saw the danger clearly. Britain, the mistress of global trade, could not allow Russia to threaten the route to India and the East. France, seeking prestige after years of political turmoil, was equally determined to block Russian ambition. Both feared that if Russia carved up the Ottoman Empire, the delicate balance of European power would be shattered. So, when Russian troops marched into Ottoman territory in 1853, seizing the Danubian principalities, the Ottomans declared war. The British and French governments, after months of uneasy diplomacy, threw their weight behind the Sultan. It was not love of Turkey that drove them. It was cold calculation. They would fight not for the sick man's survival, but to stop the bear from feasting on his corpse. What began as a quarrel in Jerusalem had become a contest for empire. And in the autumn of 1854, the quarrel crossed the Black Sea. Armies from Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, later joined by Sardinia, were ferried in their tens of thousands onto the Crimean Peninsula. Their target was the great Russian naval base of Sevastopol, home to the Black Sea Fleet, the beating heart of Russia's southern power. If Sevastopol fell, Russia's dream of Mediterranean dominance would die with it. Sevastopol was not merely a city, it was a symbol, a colossus on the Black Sea, a marriage of stone and steel, faith and firepower. Built upon a deep natural harbour, its waters cut like a blade into the Crimean coast, wide enough to shelter fleets, narrow enough to defend. Along its quays stood forests of masts, the Black Sea Fleet riding at anchor, their black hulls gleaming, their broadsides bristling with iron. Arsenals lined the waterfront, piled with timber, rope, powder and guns, the sinews of a naval empire. Above the bay, the land rose steep and commanding, crowned with bastions of earth and stone. Batteries peered from the heights like watchful eyes, their cannon commanding every approach by land and sea. Streets ran down to the water in bright tiers, whitewashed houses dazzling in the southern sun, domes of Orthodox churches catching the light like beacons. Yet beneath the painted facades, everything spoke of war. Magazines sunk deep in rock, casemates echoing with drill, barracks full of sailors, turned soldiers, their lives tied to the defence of the fortress. To the Russians, Sevastopol was pride and lifeblood. It was the anchor of their navy, the sentinel of their empire's southern frontier. To Britain and France, it was a threat, a dagger pointed at the Mediterranean, at the routes to India, at their own imperial ambitions. And so, when the war began, it was understood on all sides that Sevastopol was the prize. To seize it was to humble Russia. To lose it was unthinkable. The stage was set. Diplomacy had failed. Pride, empire, and faith had entwined into a knot that could only be cut by steel. And so, in the autumn of 1854, tens of thousands of men were ferried across the sea to settle the matter with fire and steel. The men crammed aboard those ships were restless too. British redcoats in stiff woolen tunics, sweating in the stuffy holds. French soldiers singing bawdy marching songs on the decks, their bugles and drums echoing over the waves, Turkish infantry polishing the long barrels of old muskets, cavalrymen fretting over horses kept below decks too long, the air thick with their smell. They had been told little, only that they would land, march, and fight. The enemy was waiting inland, Russian regulars, tough men from the steppes and forests, commanded by Prince Menshikov. None of the Allied rank and file had seen the ground ahead. They would discover it with their boots and bayonets. For the moment, the sea was their world. Soldiers leaned on the rails, staring at the cliffs in the distance, wondering how many of them would still be alive when the campaign was done. The Allies chose to land not at Sevastopol itself, too heavily defended, its harbour bristling with guns, but at Eupatoria, some 30 miles up the Crimean coast to the north. Eupatoria lay on the western shore of the peninsula, a small port town with wide sandy beaches that offered easier access for landing troops and supplies. Its location was intended to allow the Allies to disembark with less resistance and then march southward along the coastal plain toward their true objective, Sevastopol. From Eupatoria, the route followed the curve of the Black Sea, a natural corridor leading directly to the great fortress, while keeping the Allied armies, supplied by their fleets, sailing close offshore. It was a strategic compromise, safer than a direct assault on Sevastopol's harbour, but close enough to strike at the heart of Russian power once the armies had gathered their strength. However, the actual landing at Eupatoria was chaos dressed as order. Longboats splashed into the surf, crammed with men and horses, waves smashed against their hulls, drenching red tunics and blue coats alike. Oarsmen cursed, pulling hard as spray blinded them. When the boats scraped the shore, soldiers leapt over the sides, packs weighing heavy, muskets held high to keep the powder dry. Some stumbled, some fell, some drowned before their boots even touched the land. Horses were forced into the sea, swimming frantically beside the craft, nostrils flaring, hooves kicking. Guns were manhandled ashore on makeshift rafts, wheels sinking deep into wet sand. But there was no resistance. The Russians had withdrawn inland, leaving the landing unopposed. And so, one by one, the Allied armies established a beachhead. Tents rose in ragged rows, cook fires smoked, the clang of hammers echoed as supply wagons were assembled. The Crimean campaign had begun. The march south was punishing. The Crimean peninsula was beautiful, but cruel. Sunlight glared on rolling hills. Dust clung to every mouthful of air. The earth was hard, the wells few, the water brackish. Columns of men staggered forward under the weight of 60-pound packs, sweat soaking their wool uniforms, lips cracked with thirst. Yet there was wonder too. Vineyards heavy with grapes lined the valleys. Orchards offered apples and pears. Soldiers snatched what they could as they marched, stuffing pockets and mouths, the juice a brief relief from the choking dust. But as they advanced, the mood darkened. Villages lay abandoned, doors hanging open, hearths cold. Chickens scuttled wild. Dogs barked in empty courtyards. Civilians had fled before the Allied host, leaving ghost towns in their wake. And always ahead, rumours of the Russian army gathering strength. Prince Menshikov had indeed chosen his ground. He pulled his 35,000 men back to the Alma River, a natural defensive line cutting across the Allied path. The Alma itself was not wide, but it was swift, its banks steep, its ridges rising beyond like a great wall. On those ridges the Russians dug in. They built redoubts, hauled cannon into position, lined the slopes with bayonets. From that high ground they could sweep the valley below with fire. It was a position any commander would admire, a fortress of earth and elevation. To the British and French generals who finally glimpsed it, the sight was sobering. The river sparkled in the sun, but it might as well have been a mote of flame. Among the Allied officers there was tension. Lord Raglan, commander of the British, favoured a frontal assault. Saint-Arnaud, the French commander, gravely ill but determined to see battle, preferred a flanking move near the sea. The Turks, brave but lightly armed, would support where they could. Plans were debated in tents, over maps spread on folding tables. Voices were raised, fingers jabbed, tempers short. The soldiers, meanwhile, had no voice in the matter. They marched. They cleaned their muskets. They sharpened bayonets and cursed the heat. They wrote letters home, to mothers, to wives, to sweethearts. Letters that might never be delivered, words that might be their last. One private of the Royal Fusiliers scrawled in his diary, "We're told the Russians are waiting in numbers upon the high ground. God knows how we shall climb it under their guns. The men are steady, but none speak of it aloud. Each of us carries the thought quietly." Weapons were inspected, cleaned, and recleaned. The British carried the Mini rifle, a muzzle-loading musket firing a conical bullet, accurate to several hundred yards. Its bark was sharp, its recoil heavy, and in skilled hands it was deadly. The French had similar rifles, their troops trained to skirmish in open order. The Russians, however, still relied heavily on smoothbore muskets. At close range they were brutal, but beyond 100 yards, their balls scattered wide. Artillery was the greater terror. Heavy Russian guns, loaded with round shot and shell, could tear gaps in any formation that dared to advance. The British and French had guns too, but fewer, and they would have to haul them across the river under fire. Each soldier knew it. The battle to come would not be won by courage alone. It would be fought under the shadow of powder and iron. The evening before battle was strangely quiet. Campfires dotted the valley, their smoke rising into a still sky. The murmur of thousands of men drifted on the breeze, songs, prayers, whispered jokes to mask unease. Horses stamped and whickered, their breath steaming in the cool night. The glow of lanterns lit the surgeons' tents, where knives and saws were laid out in readiness. On the ridge above, Russian sentries peered down, their shapes dark against the firelight below. Drums echoed faintly as their regiments settled into position, bayonets fixed, eyes on the valley. They knew the Allies would come at dawn. They knew the Alma would be tested. A British officer, walking the picket line, later wrote, "The night was clear, the stars bright above us. I thought of England and of my wife's face, and wondered if I should see either again. The men lay wrapped in their coats, silent, waiting. It was the stillness before the storm. At first light on the 20th of September, 1854, the Allies began to form. Drums beat the assembly, bugles called. Columns shook themselves awake and marched into line. Red, blue and green uniforms stretched across the valley, flags rippling in the rising breeze. Officers rode before the ranks, sabres flashing. The air smelled of powder, of horse sweat, of fear. The Russians were already awake. Their batteries stood loaded, gunners with linstocks ready. Infantry waited in disciplined ranks behind earthworks. On the hillsides, sharpshooters watched through the morning haze. The stage was set. The Allies faced the river, the Russians waited above. The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. And then the first cannon roared, the Russian guns thundered. Smoke blossomed from the ridges, white and acrid, drifting down the slopes. The first round shot tore across the valley, ploughing through vines and earth, bouncing and shrieking like demons loosed from hell. Shells burst in the air, showering fragments of iron that ripped through flesh and bone. Men staggered and fell before the battle had even truly begun. Horses screamed, rearing against harness and reins. The earth shook with the weight of iron. The air stank of sulphur. And still, the British and French columns marched forward. Drums rattled, bugles shrilled. Orders were barked above the din. The armies were moving into the teeth of Russian fire. On the Allied left, near the sea, the French advanced first. General Bosquet's division, led by the agile Zouave, began climbing the cliffs that flanked the Russian line. These were sheer, chalky heights, seemingly impassable. But the Zouaves, veterans of North Africa, nimble and fearless, clung to vines, scrambled up gullies, hauled one another forward with outstretched hands. Above them, Russian skirmishers fired down, musket balls snapping through the air, stones clattered loose, rolling underfoot. But the French pressed on, their bugles cutting through the gunfire. One officer cried, "En avant, mes enfants!" to the top. Slowly, stubbornly, they scaled the cliffs. If they succeeded, they would turn the Russian flank. In the centre, the British prepared to cross the river. The 1st Division under the Duke of Cambridge, guardsmen resplendent in scarlet, bearskins tall, muskets gleaming, marched into the vineyards that bordered the Alma's banks. Grapes burst underfoot, their juice staining boots and trousers, the air filled with the scent of crushed fruit, mingling bizarrely with the stench of powder. At the river's edge, men waded in. Water foamed against their shins, then their waists. Packs dragged at their shoulders. Muskets were held high, bayonets catching the sun. Officers urged them on, waving swords, their voices hoarse against the boom of cannon. Then the Russian guns found their range. The river erupted. Round shot plunged into the water, fountains of spray and blood. Shells burst overhead, shards of iron slashing through ranks. Men were cut down in clusters, some swept away by the current, others sinking with their heavy kit. Yet the red line did not falter. The guards pushed forward, climbing the far bank, mud clinging to their boots, faces blackened with smoke. The Coldstream, the Grenadiers, the Scots Fusiliers, each fought to keep formation as the storm of iron raged above them. One guardsman later wrote, "It was as though the very sky had opened and rained fire upon us. We could scarce see for the smoke, yet still we climbed, bayonets forward, praying only to reach the ridge. On the heights, Russian infantry waited, grey-coated musketeers, their bayonets fixed, their officers shouting encouragement. Behind them, More guns belched flame, loading and firing as fast as crews could manage. The slopes were a cauldron, smoke rolling, musket balls whining, cannon roaring like thunderclaps. The British line staggered under the assault. Companies intermingled. Officers fell. Colours wavered. Confusion spread. Some battalions broke into ragged clusters, men huddling for cover behind walls and vines. Others pressed on in grim silence, eyes fixed on the ridge above. It seemed for a moment that the river would consume them, that the advance would collapse under sheer weight of fire. But discipline held. Officers rallied their men, waving swords, cursing and cajoling. "Forward, lads, forward! The ridge is ours if we take it." Drums beat furiously, muskets cracked in ragged volleys. Slowly, painfully, the guards and line regiments pushed higher. Their Minier rifles began to tell. The conical bullets, accurate at ranges the Russians could not match, struck down gunners and infantry alike. Smoke swirled, screams echoed, and the Russian line began to waver. Meanwhile, to the left, the French Zouaves burst onto the cliff top. With a shout and the clash of steel, they flung themselves against the Russian flank. Bayonets stabbed, sabres flashed. The sudden shock threw the defenders into confusion. Menshikov's carefully drawn line was beginning to bend. Still, the Russians did not yield easily. Fresh battalions were thrown into the fray, their drums beating, their officers bellowing commands. They surged down the slope, colliding with the weary British climbing from the river. Muskets flared at point-blank range. Bayonets clashed, steel grinding against steel. Men fought hand-to-hand in smoke so thick they could barely see the foe before them. A sergeant of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers described it. The smoke was so dense we could scarce tell friend from enemy. It was bayonet and musket butt, grappling in the mud, each man for himself. I struck at shapes in the murk, and when it cleared, the ground was carpeted with dead. The slopes of Alma became a charnel house. High above, Lord Raglan watched through his telescope. From his vantage on a hill, he saw the chaos unfolding. British and French lines blurring, Russian reserves pouring forward, the riverbank littered with fallen. He scribbled orders furiously, sending aides galloping down with commands to press harder, to bring up the guns, to commit reserves. But even as his messages went out, the battle was moving beyond the reach of tidy orders. In the smoke and confusion, the fight belonged not to generals, but to the stubborn will of men locked in desperate combat. Then came a moment of terrible crisis. The guards, battered and bloodied, began to fall back. Their officers were dead or wounded, their formations shattered. Russian infantry surged down, bayonets glinting, driving them towards the river. A breakthrough seemed imminent. Disaster hung by a thread. At that instant, reinforcements arrived. The 2nd Division under Sir de Lacy Evans pushed forward into the maelstrom. Fresh volleys cracked, lines steadied, the retreat halted. Officers shouted, colours waved, drums beat. Slowly the tide turned again. With renewed determination, the British surged upward once more. The fight for the Great Redoubt was the climax. This key Russian battery, bristling with heavy guns, dominated the centre of the ridge. Its parapets were lined with infantry, its embrasures belching flame. The slopes leading to it were slick with blood, the air a choking haze of smoke and powder. Regiment after regiment hurled themselves at it. Men clambered over bodies, through vineyards, across stone walls, muskets firing as fast as powder, and shot could be rammed down the barrel. The roar was deafening, the ground trembling with every blast. At last, the British and French reached the parapets. With a roar, they surged over. Bayonets plunged, muskets fired point blank, men grappled with bare hands. Russian gunners fought to the last, swinging rammers and sponges like clubs. The redoubt was a furnace of death. But the Allies would not be denied. By early afternoon, the Russian centre was collapsing. French troops, having secured the cliffs, now pressed into the flank. British regiments poured into the captured works, turning Russian guns upon their former masters. The defenders, battered from all sides, began to give way. Prince Menshikov, realizing the day was lost, ordered a retreat. His columns withdrew in some order, but the ridge was abandoned. Russian flags came down. Allied banners rose in their place. The heights above the Alma, once thought impregnable, now belonged to the Allies. The battlefield was a vision of hell. The river ran red with blood. Bodies lay tangled in vineyards, sprawled on slopes, heaped around the redoubts. Horses screamed in their death throes. Artillery pieces stood abandoned. Smoke drifted in ragged clouds. The moans of the wounded filled the air, mingling with the crackle of burning timbers and the groan of wagons carrying the injured back to camp. Surgeons' tents overflowed, saws and knives working ceaselessly, chloroform and brandy the only relief. A British officer wrote home, "We have taken the ridge, but at what cost? The ground is strewn with our brothers. Never have I seen such carnage. It was not a battle, but a slaughter. And yet, amid the horror, there was triumph. The Allied armies had crossed the Alma. They had stormed an entrenched position under murderous fire and driven the Russians from the field. The road to Sevastopol now lay open, but the cost weighed heavily. Thousands lay dead or maimed, and though the victory was real, it was not decisive. The Russian army, bloodied but intact, had escaped to fight again. The soldiers knew it. As they slumped in the captured works, muskets resting, throats raw with smoke, they gazed southwards. Ahead lay the great fortress of Sevastopol. Ahead lay more marches, more sieges, more battles. Alma was but the beginning. The smoke drifted slowly from the heights, veiling the sun in a hazy glow. By late afternoon, the thunder of guns had subsided to scattered cracks. Isolated volleys from rearguards, the dull boom of a cannon fired in anger and desperation. But the great battle was done. The Allies stood upon the ridges above the Alma. They had stormed a position thought unassailable, had forced the river under fire, had driven the Russians from their redoubts. It was, beyond doubt, a victory. And yet, when soldiers looked around them, triumph was hard to taste. The ridge was littered with the dead and dying. Smoke curled from shattered batteries, mingling with the acrid stench of blood and burnt powder. The moans of the wounded rose in waves, a sound more dreadful than the roar of cannon. The Russians were retreating. Menshikov's columns pulled back in order, their drums beating, their wagons creaking under the weight of wounded and salvaged guns. They had been beaten from the ridge, but not destroyed. Their losses were terrible, thousands killed or maimed. Yet enough of their army escaped to remain a formidable foe. For the Allies, this was a bitter truth. They had won the ground, but not the decisive victory they had hoped for. Sevastopol still waited, strong and unbroken. On the battlefield, the human cost revealed itself in grim detail. British guards lay sprawled on the slopes, their scarlet tunics darkened with blood. French zouaves, so lively in their climb, lay twisted among the vines, their red trousers soaked through. Russian infantry littered the parapets, their grey greatcoats heaped in ghastly piles around abandoned guns. The river itself was choked with bodies, men who had fallen crossing, swept away by the current, weighed down by packs and rifles. Horses lay bloated in the shallows, their flanks torn by shell and shot. One Times correspondent, William Howard Russell, wrote, "The field was a vision of death, such as I had never before witnessed. Men lay in attitudes of struggle, their faces blackened with powder, their eyes glassy in the sun. The vineyards, so rich with fruit that morning, were trampled into mire and gore. The air reeked with decay before nightfall. Surgeons worked ceaselessly in their tents. Amputations were performed with terrifying speed. The saw biting, the stump cauterized, the patient half-drugged with chloroform or numbed only with brandy. Piles of limbs grew outside the flaps, grisly evidence of the day's harvest. The wounded cried out, begged for water, clutched at the hands of nurses. Some whispered for mothers, wives, sweethearts, names carried on dying lips into the night. Florence Nightingale was not yet in Crimea. That revolution in care was still months away. For now, medical service was crude, overwhelmed, brutal. Men survived by chance as much as skill. Many did not survive at all. Among the soldiers who endured, the battle left indelible marks. A young fusilier remembered the horror of crossing the river, the shock of seeing comrades fall with scarcely a sound, cut down by unseen guns. "I thought myself a dead man every step," he later recalled. "Yet somehow I climbed, and when I reached the ridge, I could not believe I was still breathing." French veterans, though jubilant at their flank success, spoke quietly of comrades who had fallen mid-climb, plunging from the cliffs into the surf below. Turkish auxiliaries, though lightly engaged, were shaken by the scale of slaughter they had witnessed. Each army carried away its ghosts. The evening after Alma was eerily still. Campfires dotted the ridges, their glow faint in the encroaching dark. The guns were silent at last, their barrels blackened with use. Men huddled in groups, too exhausted to speak, some staring blankly into the flames. Others wept openly, grief for comrades overtaking the pride of victory. Officers walked the lines, counting survivors, gathering stragglers, reading the toll of the day. Regiments that had marched with bright banners now stood as fragments, half their strength gone. Colours riddled with shot were lowered in silence. A guards officer wrote that night, "We hold the field, but I do not feel we have conquered. We are hollowed by our loss. Victory tastes of ash when so many good men lie cold behind us. For Lord Raglan and St. Arnaud, the victory brought little relief. Their armies had performed with courage, but coordination was poor, communication clumsy, and command uncertain. Raglan's orders had often gone astray in the smoke. St. Arnaud, mortally ill, had struggled to exert his authority. What should have been a crushing blow had become instead a costly slog. Strategically, the Allies had succeeded. The Russians had been forced from their chosen line, but tactically the flaws were plain. The soldiers had carried the day not through brilliance of command, but through sheer, stubborn endurance. In the capitals of Europe, the news of Alma was greeted with jubilation. In London, church bells rang, crowds cheered, and newspapers proclaimed the valour of the redcoats. In Paris, the Zouaves were hailed as heroes, their daring climb lauded as proof of French élan. Constantinople rejoiced that its allies had checked the Russian bear. But in St. Petersburg, grief and fury mixed. The Tsar mourned the loss of his soldiers, but vowed that Russia would not yield. The retreat from Alma was but a setback, he declared. Sevastopol would stand. The empire would endure. And so the war stretched onward. For the men who fought there, Alma became a watershed. It was not Waterloo. It was something darker, more modern. The power of entrenched artillery had stunned them. The slaughter wrought by rifled fire had shocked them. Alma revealed that the old tactics of massed lines and proud colours were doomed before the storm of industrial war. A British private summed it in his journal. "I had thought battle a matter of courage, but here courage seemed madness. To march into such fire was like walking into a furnace. And yet we did, because there was no other way. The vineyards of Alma would never be the same. Where once grapes had hung heavy in the sun, the ground was trampled and fouled, the vines torn, the soil thick with blood. Locals returning days later found their homes ruined, their fields desecrated, their wells poisoned with corpses. War had come to their valley, and it left scars that would endure long after the armies marched away. In the sweep of history, the Battle of Alma mattered because it was the Allies' first great test and their first bitter lesson. It showed that courage alone could still carry a ridge, but at unthinkable cost. It showed that technology was reshaping the battlefield. Rifled muskets, explosive shells, entrenched artillery. It showed the world, through the eyes of journalists and dispatches carried by telegraph, what modern war looked like. And perhaps most of all, Alma showed that the Crimean War would not be quick, nor easy, nor glorious. It would be long, grinding, and merciless. For the Allies, Alma opened the road to Sevastopol, but the fortress was not yet taken. Ahead lay Balaclava, Inkerman, and the long siege. Ahead lay hunger, disease, and winter. Alma was the opening chapter of a tragedy that would stretch for years. But to those who stood in the vineyards and crossed the river under fire, it was the day the world changed. The day Europe learned again what war in the modern age would mean. The day the Alma ran red and the air burned with shot and shell, a river of fire that seared itself into memory. Join me next time as we march to Balaclava, where steadfast lines, daring charges, and a tragic blunder would etch themselves into legend. And as always, thank you for listening to Fireside History. Your support helps keep the fire burning.